Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamry. I'm the president here at CSIS, and we are delighted that you are joining us for this very, very interesting conversation. I want to thank Suzanne Spalding for creating this serious look into SolarWinds and what it says about America. And I will quickly turn to Suzanne, but I just would like to make just a preliminary remark. It was now 23 years ago when I was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I disclosed to the American public that we had a serious cyber attack. Now, in retrospect, at the time, it was very naive and innocent, but it was a serious issue for us. And my boss was pretty unhappy that I did that, but I knew there was no way to mobilize a department as big and complicated as the Defense Department to take it seriously. And it's gratifying to see how well we have advanced, but we still have massive issues and problems in this country. We're going to explore that today. And so, Suzanne, thank you for leading this, and we look forward to hearing all of these wonderful panelists.
Dr. Hamry, thank you so much for that introduction and for providing that historical perspective on today's conversation, reminding us how long we have been wrestling with this seemingly intractable issue. And thank you also, as always, for your strong support for these important conversations. Very much appreciate it. Welcome, everyone, to part 2 of our conversation about the SolarWinds hack and related events. I am Suzanne Spalding. I'm the senior advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies for Homeland Security, and I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions project. So part 1 of this program took place at the beginning of this week on February 22nd, when I had the opportunity to talk with SolarWinds' new CEO, Sudhakar Ramakrishna, who provided some interesting insights into how this hack played out in SolarWinds, what steps they took upon learning about the hack, and what subsequent steps they've initiated to reflect lessons learned so far. He also provided some specific examples about the way government can more effectively work with companies like SolarWinds when they're subject to malicious cyber activity. If you missed that conversation, I'd encourage you to go back and watch the video. I thought it was really enlightening. After our conversation on Monday at the start of the week, throughout the week, Sudhakar had several opportunities to testify on Capitol Hill, along with at least one of the hearings with Kevin Mandia and Brad Smith and others through the week. So today we close out this week and we hear from policymakers and experts about what they think are some of the important takeaways so far and what we need to do differently going forward. It's a great panel and includes 2 people with whom I worked closely when I was the Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security, Congressman Mike McCall, who was then chair of the Homeland Security Committee and still co-chairs the Congressional Cyber Caucus, and Jeanette Manfra, who was the Assistant Secretary for Cyber. Great to see you both. Our panelists will get a fuller introduction from our wonderful panel moderator, Glenn Gerstel. But I get the pleasure of introducing Glenn. Glenn, I am really pleased to say, is a colleague here at CSIS. We were lucky to grab him. He is a senior advisor for the International Security Program. He has already written and spoken widely about the intersection of technology and national security and privacy. Glenn, of course, served as the General Counsel of the National Security Agency from 2015 to 2020. Before that, he practiced law for almost 40 years at the international law firm of Milbank, LLP, where he focused on global telecommunications and served as the managing partner of the law firm's Washington, D.C., Singapore, and Hong Kong offices. Glenn served on the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, which falls within the organization that I used to lead at the Department of Homeland Security. That body reports to the President and to the Secretary of Homeland Security on security threats to the national infrastructure. He's a graduate of New York University and Columbia University School of Law. He's an elected member of the American Academy of Diplomacy and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a recipient of the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service, and the NSA Distinguished Civilian Service Medal. We are lucky to have him here at CSIS. And Glenn, I look forward to this panel discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you so much, Dr. Hamre, and to CSIS for this. And Suzanne, that was an excessively long introduction. We'll discuss it later. One of the aspects about this panel is it couldn't possibly be more timely because just minutes ago, for those of you watching currently live, the House Oversight Committee and Homeland Security Committees just concluded seconds ago a hearing on this very topic, the SolarWinds hack. To address that in greater detail, we have three terrific panelists, and I have the pleasure of introducing them. I'll try to do that in alphabetical order. We'll start with Lieutenant General retired Ed Carden, who is now a senior counselor at the Cohen Group. He retired from the United States Army as a West Point graduate and after 36 years of commanding troops around the world. I had the good fortune of overlapping with him when he served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army Cyber Command. And after that, undertaking that command, he had an exceptional job in the United States Army as being in charge of the transformational unit that set up Army Futures Command, one of the most important organizational changes in the Army in a period of decades. Our next panelist is Representative Mike McCall, whom I've also had the pleasure of working with when he was when I was at NSA and he was the head of the House Homeland Security Committee. The congressman who just suffered through, I guess, 5 days or so of freezing weather with no electricity and water in his home in Austin, is now in his 8th term representing a district in Texas that includes Austin. He started his career in the United States Attorney's Office, was in the Department of Justice in Washington and the Texas State Attorney General's Office, all of which gave him a long background in national and homeland security matters. He currently serves as the ranking member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He's a member, as I mentioned, of the House Committee on Homeland Security, and as Suzanne also mentioned earlier, is the co-chair of the House Cybersecurity Caucus. And then another former U.S. Army member, Jeanette Manfra, is the Director of Government Security and Compliance at Google Cloud. After serving in the Department of Homeland Security in a variety of significant senior cyber policy roles, she was appointed as the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity at CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency. She left there at the end of 2019 to join Google, as I said. So with that, we have a terrific panelist, and let's jump right into the questions. And maybe we can just start with the fact that we've all read the news. We've seen so many articles about this hack apparently caused by Russia, although there's been no formal government attribution to that. We just saw hearings a couple of days ago from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, holding a rare public hearing on this topic with representatives from a cybersecurity firm, from SolarWinds, and from Microsoft, actually the heads of those organizations. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we just also concluded minutes ago hearings by the House on the same topic. So with all this background, what we've learned so far, and we've learned a lot, I'd like to ask the panelists, do you feel that this particular hack has changed anything? Is this just something bigger, but it's more of the same? Is this qualitatively different? After all, no Bitcoins were stolen, no blueprints appear to have been stolen, no data appears to be corrupted. So is this really something the same as what we've been seeing before, but just on a bigger scale, or is this really different in some way, and if so, how? General Carden, maybe I could start with you on that.
Thank you for the introduction, Glenn, and it's an honor to be here with all of you today. 3 points maybe on what you just said. First is, I do think it's different. We normally don't see software supply chain attacks of this scale. The way I look at it, one intrusion, that's an incident. 18,000 intrusions, that looks more like something very different. So that's the first one. The second thing, though, that I'm encouraged about is the information sharing, but it's also pointing a number of holes in the way we do this. So no one can see all the data. The government sees their data, the DoD sees their data, the private industry sees their data, and there's all kinds of restrictions on this. So no one can see it all. And it's been quite an effort, both public and private, to put this together. And the last one is, of course, these tools that started all this with Kevin Manday came forward in December. Given with all the other tools that have been taken over the years with these tools, what does that bode for the future? And I'll stop there.
Okay, good. Congressman, your perspective from the government?
Yeah, and thank you, Glenn. Thanks to CSIS. I remember co-chairing the famous report that we came out with on cybersecurity. Gosh, it's probably like a decade ago. And what a great exercise that was. Suzanne Spalding, just want to give a great shout out for her service at DHS, and her leadership on cyber was extraordinary, and it helped me to elevate the cybersecurity agency within DHS and authorize it into law. And I think it has really stood up as a great organization. Chris Krebs, of course, I thought did a phenomenal job, who's now working for SolarWinds. I have a little bit of an attachment to SolarWinds. They're in my district in Austin. And so when the breach first occurred, that was one of the first ones that I think they contacted. And I talked to, the new president and CEO, Ramakrishna, about what happened. And I think what is different about this, I think to the previous witnesses' point, the scale is so massive, and we still don't know what the damage is to this day. Also, the type of malware itself was very sophisticated and very deceptive. It could literally enter into the system and leave without leaving any trace or fingerprints, if you will. The intrusions initially occurred in March of 2020 and lasted through June. It was not fully detected until December of 2020, at which time Microsoft developed the kill switch to basically take down the malware within 2 days, which was extraordinary. But by that time, the damage has been done. I don't think it was destructive in nature. I think it was more of a theft espionage type of exercise. And by all accounts, without getting into the classified side of things, I think Russia's, if you talk about attributions, very, very, very good assumption this is coming from Russia. And so there's so much more to talk about in terms of how we respond to all this. I'm also you mentioned Army Futures Command. We're so delighted to have that in Austin, Texas as well, doing a phenomenal job. But that's kind of my short take on SolarWinds.
Okay, thank you, Congressman. Jeanette, your perspective now that you're in the private sector?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me. Nice to be here with my former boss, Suzanne. And I think this might be the first event I've done with Mr. McCall where he wasn't asking me questions from the days. So and this is less stressful.
And you're not under oath.
Exactly. So, I think to your question about whether it's qualitatively different, I think it may be a little bit too soon to tell. This isn't the first supply chain attack. It's probably not going to be the last. I think from my perspective, what's significant about it, similar to other, big incidents that the government has had to deal with, is it's a moment to shine a light on challenges in what I'll call the overall system. And there's been a lot of talk about why are defenses not their information sharing, why can't we detect these things? And I think that's really important to talk about, like building better cyber defenses. But I think for too long that's been sort of the exclusive focus, and there really needs to be more talk about like why is the system overall not more secure? And this is really one of the reasons when I decided to leave government and what attracted me to Google is the notion of that both that obligation, but also that opportunity to drive modern security architectures to make sure that our overall software ecosystem was more secure. And so I think thinking about it, from the government as a consumer of IT services and products, is what could we be doing to better modernize those systems to make sure that, one, technologically to have more of the security capabilities, those modern security capabilities, but also from an operational perspective, how the government thinks about risk overall needs to better include the risk of technology. And I think this is a really important moment when that highlights that lack of integration as government and not just government, but companies, everybody sort of thinking about their dependency on software and infrastructure, and being able to mature their understanding of how do they manage that risk, and not just from the technological perspective, but from the entire organization's mission perspective. So I would say I'd love to see more of that conversation. And I think this really highlights, and it's a moment where people can start to have those questions and those conversations across the public and private sector.
Thank you. Well, all three of you have raised lots of good points, that each of which we could probably spend half an hour on. Let me draw your attention to just two of them. During the hearings that we've had in the Senate and the House, the witnesses talking about the SolarWinds hack made a point. They made 2 points, which I'd like to ask you all to comment on. One is that during the course of the hack, they didn't think the private sector was able to quickly get threat intelligence information into the hands of government and the private sector quick enough to do something about it. So this hack persisted evidently for months. Of course, it was only discovered in December, apparently, but even then it was slow to really get dispersed. It took a matter of weeks. And a number of the witnesses at these hearings have said, gee, we need some kind of mechanism to share threat intelligence in a very quick way to prevent a hack of this size from spreading. And then secondly, the hearings brought out the point, and also the CSIS interview with the CEO of SolarWinds brought out the point that although some 18,000 customers of SolarWinds evidently were potentially had the malware implanted or use the SolarWinds update to implant malware and sort of get a backdoor into company systems, only a much smaller number, perhaps just a handful of government agencies, still important, and perhaps 100 companies actually were victims of further exploration and exploitation, where the attackers, again presumed to be Russia, not only entered, but then were able to roam around, so to speak, inside the networks. And the point was made, normal cybersecurity programs and protocols could have stopped that further exploration. So I'd like to ask the panel, and Congressman, we'll start with you on the government side. Do you think the laws need to be tightened up, one, to require mandatory breach notification or to permit early threat intelligence warning without liability? And do you think we should have minimum cybersecurity standards of the sort that might have prevented further exploitation of this hack?
Well, and thank you for the question, Glenn. That's actually one of the precise questions I asked the CEO of Microsoft. And it's the issue of breach notification and mandatory breach notifications. When we set up CISA, it was done in the civilian space to be the sort of the central clearinghouse for threat information as a civilian agency with the private sector. We had that bubble chart back in the day. We had NSA and DoD Cyber Command offensively, defending in a time of warfare, FBI investigating, and then DHS being the information sharing mechanism. Brad Smith, the CEO or president of Microsoft, agreed with me that he thinks it's time to have a mandatory breach notification system. Jim Longman and I have always teamed up on these issues. We introduced or are planning to introduce a bill on that. And I think that would go a long ways. Now, some of this was, reported early on, but some companies don't report this at all. And it's important that we have that threat information to share it across, not only with all the private sector, where about 80% of this resides, but across all departments within the federal government. And this can be done very easily, like what we do when we sanitize threat or classified information. We take out sources and methods, and we take out certain names. We would take out the name of the company because the fiduciary duty to the shareholder, and really just have the threat information itself. What is the malware itself? What are the ones and zeros? What can we share that will not compromise the company who notifies the government about the breach? I think liability protection is also something that we should be looking at, so that it's very clear that there will not be lawsuits, and that would encourage even more information sharing with the Department of Homeland Security and the federal government. So I think this is really ripe for legislation, and to get that on the record from all the witnesses being supportive of this law, I think is a great step forward.
Thanks. And do you feel we should go a step farther and also have government impose or industry impose in some kind of self-regulatory way minimum cybersecurity standards, or should we leave that up to the?
I always like it to be more voluntary. But we have the NIST standards. When they become just more of a check the box exercise, I don't think that it's very meaningful. So if we do have a list of standards that companies would have to comply with, we want that to be very meaningful. And then I guess to your point, and I'd like to hear from the private sector as well, I'm sure they would prefer it to be voluntary, not mandatory. But look, this world's getting more and more dangerous in the cyberspace. And if the private sector can't do it on its own, we may have to look at mandating it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Congressman. I think the issue, from my sense in talking to some of my colleagues, is that that voluntary standards are probably going to work for the very large, sophisticated companies that have the resources and talent, cybersecurity talent within the company to deal with that. But when you get into smaller companies, mid-sized companies, who again are part of the supply chain for the bigger companies, so it's still a vulnerability we need to address. I think that's where the problem is, and I worry that industry self-regulation alone may not be sufficient. The economic incentives probably aren't all that strong. It's not a profit center to spend lots of money on your firewalls and configuring your systems. So I think that's a problem that the private sector needs to grapple with. I'll just ask quickly, Jeanette, if she has a perspective on that now that she's in the private sector, and then we'll move on to other questions. And in fact, let me just mention to the audience that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. If you want to submit a question, we'll try to get to them at the end, but you can put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Jeanette, back to you.
Yeah, I would say, as Representative McCall mentioned, there are mechanisms for information sharing, and so there's maybe some potential to learn from it. Why aren't some of these mechanisms maybe working as well as they should? But they do exist, and so I think it's really incumbent on the private sector, and particularly the large companies that have that visibility, to continue to develop that relationship, as well as the government. Of course, my former agency has spent a lot of time working on building that out. And that there's maturing that needs to happen, and I know the new folks there are going to work on that. From my perspective, both from the government and from this side, information sharing is a little bit too broad of a term, and to get real action. And so really trying to drive down to what's the outcome, what specific thing are we trying to avoid, and who has that information or intelligence and can get it to us, and really building those pathways so that the government and the private sector are not just sort of having broad general conversations about threat intelligence, because there's really no sort of overall incentive on either side, frankly, to share much specific. But if we can talk about, we're talking about specific scenarios here that we want to prevent. These are the types of companies that have that information. Let's build a model to get that information flowing back and forth. So that's kind of on the information sharing side of things. I would say on sort of the part about like talking about a little bit more on supply chain and minimum cybersecurity standards. I think that standards are very, very important, and as you mentioned, oftentimes it's the very large companies who are able to fully implement that full breadth of the standards. Though not exclusively, there are very small companies who are really prize and value the differentiation that security provides. I think we need more of that, but we need to also have it on the consumer side. So the government is a very large consumer. So they need to be, driving what those security standards are that they want to see through their procurements, through their, whatever sort of mechanisms they have to purchase IT. And so I think it's really important to think about the economics and how do we drive more security through the sort of the existing processes of frankly these large procurements. And I don't think, to Representative McCall's point, there's a bit of like checking the box on some of those things, and we need to mature that function so that, back to the risk point, is that you have your procurements thinking about the risk that could introduce, and you're driving standards through those. But yes, voluntary industry global standards, I think are really crucial to solving some of these problems.
Thank you. Let me pick up on your point about incentives, which you mentioned in the context of the private sector, and turn to Ed to talk about the government and military side of things here for a second. There don't seem to be any real incentives, or maybe I should switch it the other way. There don't seem to be many disincentives for countries such as Russia to stop this kind of hacking. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that they were responsible for SolarWinds, but if it wasn't this one, they're responsible for others. And we certainly know from the 5-volume bipartisan Senate report what the Russians were up to in the 2016 elections. So my question, Ed, for you is, one, if this is just espionage and nothing was stolen, nothing was deleted, let's assume that's for argument's sake, so no physical real world damage, so to speak, and it presumably is the kind of thing that maybe our own intelligence community would like to do to the Russians. We can leave that unstated or unspecified for a minute. But what should our response be? Should we retaliate? How do we impose costs on them? And if otherwise they're free to do this with impunity? And then an allied question of, is it right for the private sector to bear the burden of foreign nation state attacks? We certainly, if Russia sent over a missile, we know what our reaction would be. Why is it okay to let the private sector suffer a cyber attack? Ed, do you want to pick up that, and maybe then we'll go to the Congressman? And Congressman, I understand you have a vote coming up in a few minutes, so when you need to step out, by all means, let us know, but if you would comment right after the general on this, that would be great.
Thanks, Glenn. So maybe I'll start with the second one first, in that it's my belief that most private companies cannot effectively defend themselves against a nation state, because the nation state can bring resources, time, other intelligence to bear that there's no way a private company can defend against. Many have done well, but if it's a determined actor and they have a lot of time and they're determined, as you know, we often talk about, defense has to be right 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Offense has to just get lucky once. And so that's that part. So I think there has to be help from the attribution side. Now, to your other question about—
Can I interrupt on there for a second? Yes. One of the things that some companies talk about is the right to hack back. How do you feel about that?
I worry about the second and third order effects of that, because I think one of the challenges we're having, and even in the discussion here, is we put the espionage in what I would call a 20th century frame, not a 21st century frame. And I'm not sure that, we say, well, it looks like espionage. It looks like espionage, but it may take us years to figure out, okay, in these companies, what are they? How does that impact others? What part of the government are they in? How long is it going to take us to find out? And then if something happened, it could turn into a destructive attack at the worst possible time. And then we'll have to say, well, that was a bad decision 4 years ago. And so we've struggled with this. I mean, I know numerous administrations have talked about retaining all options. Each one has to be looked at on its own merits. I think Defend Forward is a start, but I think one of the challenges we have is, like even SolarWinds, widely reported to be Russian, still working on true attribution, right? And so there is an element of truth to this. So I think, picking up on what Jeanette said, info sharing is a pretty broad term, but like just simple things like, for us, worldwide collection of DNS logs. I mean, it's amazing how if we would just do that, we could do a lot with attribution, but often those are missing, they're not collected, et cetera. And so I think each case has to be done on its own merit, but I don't think that this could be looked at in solely an espionage frame, because you're making assumptions forward that it will not evolve into something else when you're almost trying to prove an unknown.
Right. Well, thank you. And maybe I can just jump in with a quick comment before we go to Representative McCall. But I think that if it's just purely espionage, so to speak, traditionally we've dealt with pure espionage in spy channels. In other words, if we catch one of their double agents, we kick out one of their ours, or we kick out one of theirs, so the retaliation occurs within intelligence channels. That seems to be a little different in the cyber world. And I noticed that Brad Smith from Microsoft the other day in the hearings, as well as some government officials, have started to delineate a little bit of a difference in this particular hack, even if it turns out to be pure espionage, by talking about the broad scale of it and the reckless nature of it, namely using a supply chain mechanism in a sort of indiscriminate way to get into a very, very large, in this case, tens of thousands of companies. And somehow that's a little different from tailored, targeted espionage. So maybe there's a legal basis for creating an ability to retaliate against this kind of, quote, espionage, as opposed to old-fashioned just snooping around. Congressman, do you have any thoughts on that? And whether it's right, back to my earlier question, for the private sector to bear some of this foreign nation state burden?
Well, I agree with the general. If it's a nation state, foreign nation state adversary, I think the United States government has a duty to assist and respond. These questions, interestingly, Glenn came back. We discussed this with Jim Lewis and CSIS, 10 years ago. We don't have a definition for cyber warfare. What is cyber warfare? What constitutes an act of cyber warfare? What really is cyber espionage? Why don't we have any international norms and standards out there? I think in this particular case, it would make sense to coordinate with our European and NATO allies, and perhaps look at sanctions. But this subject matter gets a little tricky because, as you know, there are certain things that we do in the classified realm to get information about our adversaries. So when you get into this international framework, and this is precisely, it's great timing. I passed just yesterday my Cyber Diplomacy Act bill. The missing piece is always, we had DHS and CISA defending the nation, and DOD in a time of warfare standing up, and FBI investigating, and CISA sharing the information. What's always been missing, though, is this sort of ambassador-like position on cybersecurity that could negotiate with other countries and allies, particularly, certain norms and standards within cyberspace. We don't have that right now. And that's what the bill is designed to do through the State Department. And I think it will deal with the issues you've raised. And I think there are certain points of you're crossing the line too far. I think certainly a very highly destructive attack, like the NotPetya attack, I think that's getting closer into cyber warfare. But we have to define that legally as well. And I think a destructive attack like some that we've seen would warrant a proportionate response. If there isn't a cyber warfare attack, then a cyber warfare and kinetic response as well. And I think some of that was defined under the Obama administration about a proportionate response. to the attack. And I think when you get into espionage, it does get a little more tricky because, we're engaged in certain activities ourselves, and we don't want to weaken those strengths that we have. But this is all so cutting edge right now and still not well defined. And I really think this is the area that CSIS would love to continue to work with you on this, because this is the really undefined area, both of the law and also internationally, where we need to have certain standards and norms internationally. And right now we just don't. And so, like you said, Russia with impunity can attack us. China can, steal all this intellectual property. It's why we shut down the Houston consulate, because they're stealing, the vaccine. They're stealing research from Texas Medical Center, NASA, with impunity and with no response. Remember, they stole the 23 million security clearances from OPM, and there was no consequence to that action. My 5 kids, bad behavior, there are consequences. In the cyber realm internationally, when a country does this and there are no consequences, then the bad behavior continues. And I'm afraid that's what we've seen, and it's getting worse.
Thank you. I agree with your comments, and I also applaud the moving along of your cyber diplomacy bill. I think having an ambassador level person at the State Department to help coordinate the international aspects of this will be key. Let me ask you, Congressman, just if I can stay with you for just one more second, then I'll ask Jeanette to comment as well. Do you think the U.S. should join the Paris call or take other steps in a formal way in international law to outline what exactly should be illegal in cyber warfare? And do you think that's a good approach, or should we keep it sort of informal and it when you see it, giving us more flexibility to act when we want? What's your sense of that, sir?
I think this is such a cutting edge and so ill-defined, if you will, that we need better definitions. And I do think a more formalized process, like a Paris Accords type, we did this with climate change. Why aren't we doing this with cybersecurity? I would like to, when we pass the Cyber Diplomacy Act, be able to have the State Department and DHS and the Cyber Command within the DoD all come together with starting really, I think, with our NATO allies, because our NATO allies are under threat every day from the same foreign nation states, particularly Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And that would be a great starting point to come forward with some of these definitions and some of these standards and norms that then eventually we could put in MOUs and agreements with, and I think starting with our NATO allies is a good place to start. So we can have some standards and norms in agreements, and possibly even negotiate treaties with the countries, down the road. That may be something that we will be looking at down the road as well. But I think it's way overdue. And it is high time. And I think SolarWinds is another wake-up call, and it's not going to be the last one. And we're going to continue to see this as long as we don't have any consequences to these bad actions.
Okay, thank you. I completely agree. And I note that the United States is an outlier and that it has not joined the Paris call. I understand the rationale was in part that if we signed and countries like Russia and China did too, we would be obligated to honor that, and we would, but those countries wouldn't, and so we'd have an asymmetry there. That's certainly an important point. We want to make sure we didn't tie our hands back and unilaterally disarm, but by the same token,
and that's why I get back to the espionage question. That's precisely, I think, the issue at hand on espionage. I think that you're right. That would be more difficult.
Yeah. Okay, Jeanette, I wanted to come back to you.
Yeah, that was a lot. That's I think I want to sort of back to what General Cardin said. The notion that we're trying to use 20th century mindsets and thinking and strategies to apply to a 21st century problem, and what the and Mr. McCall talked about, and sort of the definitions is, we do seem to be sort of stuck in particularly, I think the government often is, well, this is how we thought about airspace, and this is how, we thought about the Navy, and then we're just going to apply that to cyberspace. And I would venture to bet that, like, if you put 5 people in a room together and ask them what the definition of cyberspace was, they would all have different definitions. So even at that level is, what are we talking about specifically can be sometimes a challenge. And it's cyberspace is not some separate domain that exists outside of our physical reality. And so, but it is unique, and that's part of the uniqueness of it, is we can't just apply, this is how we achieve strategic air deterrence, let's apply that to this new domain. And that requires a lot of creative thinking and a lot of different approaches. It also, it requires a level of like coordination and like joint operational almost with non-government entities that is really challenging to actually execute to any success. And I still think the government and the private sector, they need to continue to reorient around a new relationship in kind of jointly managing frankly, the sustainability of this technological ecosystem that we've built. And so I think, and I love the cyber diplomacy work. I think that's so important in thinking about like what are like norms of behavior in this sort of 21st century world, and how do we encourage others to participate in that. But I also think the U.S. has an obligation to be a leader there as well. And I still think there's a lot of work to be done inside of government in terms of balancing intelligence, operational, and defense priorities. It's really got to be sorted out before the private sector can kind of come in and help. But that being said, the private sector has a tremendous amount of opportunity, I will say, to be able to provide a more secure foundation upon which the rest of the world can be operating on. And so I think at Google, we take that very seriously, and we push, whether through open source or other other forums or through our own products. And we want to see more of that. We want to see everybody be able to take advantage of the investment and the modernization that the large tech companies can do for security, and have less and less of the onus on smaller organizations or individuals. It's a long journey, but I think this this could be a moment. This combined with elections and the various other things that have happened, is I think you're starting to see people really wake up. Is we have to think differently, and like the general said, we have to have a 21st century mindset in how we're solving this.
Thank you. Good, lots of good points. Congressman Nicole, are you still with us for another 5 minutes or so? I don't know if he stepped out. I know he had a vote.
No, I'm here.
You're here. Okay, so let me just quickly go to you, and then to Ed. Just to take advantage of the fact that you have to leave in a minute. Do you sense that the executive branch is organized the right way to deal with the threat we've now just been describing for the last half hour? This vast threat. We've got a new national cyber policy director, as a result of a provision recently enacted into law. The Biden administration has not yet, I believe, nominated someone for that. There are lots of senior cyber roles scattered throughout DHS, the Department of Commerce, the Pentagon. We're going to come to Ed in a minute on that. Is the executive branch organized the right way? And then just quickly, if I can sneak in a second question, how do you feel about Congress on that point?
Well, my views on Congress. I mean, the Committee on Homeland Security, I came very close to fixing the jurisdiction of that committee. And Suzanne will tell you, it takes an enormous amount of time from the Department of Homeland Security to appear before the 100+ committees and subcommittees. And it's absolutely, and I came very close to fixing it. But moving on to the bigger question, I do think this is all really, in the time that our report came out with CSIS, has really been evolving. And clearly defined roles, I think, are important. We did recommend a position in the White House to elevate the cybersecurity mission in the White House, CSIS did in the report. And that was very important with Londra and Jim Lewis, myself. The Obama administration, to their credit, elevated it and put that position in there. Unfortunately, the previous administration took it out. I'm pleased to see that the Biden administration is putting that position back in to elevate the cyber mission within the White House to oversee. But again, I think, going back to the original, what they called the bubble chart, and for kind of the people that are in the pioneer days of what is the role of the federal government, what is DoD's role? Some people thought NSA should be the information sharer with the private sector, the defense industrial based pilot program. And then we had Snowden, and then we thought, now we need a civilian agency so we don't have those kind of optics. And DHS was the obvious go-to. And then we created CISA. And I think CISA has really risen to the occasion. It was pretty rough in the beginning. They had a lot of learning curves, but they have really come a long ways in their sophistication. And again, I think the missing piece that I see within the federal government is the cyber diplomacy mission and our ability to negotiate and coordinate with our allies, in particular NATO. And what can we do within the global framework to our enemies when a very destructive attack occurs? And those parameters need to be set forth. They need to know that if there is a destructive attack against the United States, there will be a proportionate response back. Not unlike what happened yesterday when the Shia militias were bombed in Syria. They hit our embassy in Iraq, and if we don't respond, then you're operating out of weakness, not strength. And I'm always for a strong response to a strong threat. And in cyberspace is no different. If we have a strong attack against the United States or our interests, then I think they need to know, and we need a framework that's international, that the response is going to happen and you're going to get hit back. If you steal all these security clearances, there will be a response. There's not going to be just a meeting. There will be a response. If you destroy the power grid and shut it down, there will be a response to that. And that's what's uncertain right now in the global perspective that I think we really need to focus on right now.
Good. Thank you. I very much agree with your comments. Ed, let me turn to you for your perspective as a former military officer. How do you feel about the issues the congressman has just raised? And in particular, what really should be the role of U.S. Cyber Command and NSA in addressing this? Should they be in the background? Should they have a more of an aggressive position? As you know, NSA over the past year has a new cybersecurity directorate, which is working quite closely with the defense industrial base to help secure them. Should that role be expanded? What's the role of the military in this picture?
Originally, when Cyber Command was created, it was very much focused just on the military, DoD. And when we stood up Joint Task Force Ares against ISIS, it started to expose a lot of cracks in the way that this was organized. But I will say to the congressman and to Jeanette's point that there's been huge growth in this area, and the Solarium Commission also did a lot of work in this area. So back now to the role of Cyber Command and NSA. I think their role is spelled out, but much like we have with the National Guard in this country, you can provide military support to civilian authorities. And so they can ask for help, because one advantage the department has is it has a cyber mission force, right? CISA doesn't have a cyber mission force. They don't have 6,000 people that can be deployed for very unique, specialized situations. Now, the rules to do that, how that would be done, all that would have to be worked out. But I think clearly this goes to, there's not a defined line between government and commercial networks. I mean, many government networks are commercial networks. So this idea of, it's very easy to describe this, it's not so easy. And this is why we tend to devolve down more to how do we share information, and then how do we share that protection.
Hey, Glenn, I'm going to have to unfortunately leave, but I want to thank you for having me. And to the general's last point, when I was meeting with my Texas Guard in Austin at Camp Maybury, what I think is really interesting idea is you have these tech, they're like, daytime techies, that work in the IT sector, but they've joined the Texas Guard. So I think what the general is talking about is really kind of another cutting edge thing that's happening right now within the military, where you have basically full-time, because they're the civilian army essentially, right? Their daytime job is doing tech, but they're part of the Guard. And I think that's an excellent role for them to play. And so but I apologize with that. I'm going to have to do my constitutional duty.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Okay.
Ed, did you have a further comment on that or no?
No, I was.
Okay, we've got quite a large number of questions coming in. And again, there's a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. I'm going to try to consolidate a couple of these questions into one, or sort of pick out a few. There's a couple of questions having to do with one of the recommendations of the Solarium Commission, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, about having some kind of mandatory equipment or software certification system to help deal with the supply chain vulnerabilities, and a related series of questions about how private sector companies can manage a multiplicity of third-party cybersecurity vendors, and how that needs to be addressed. Jeanette, since you have the advantage of being both both at CISA as well as now currently at Google Cloud, what's your sense of what we need to do in terms of equipment and software? Do we need something the equivalent like a underwriter's laboratory before we plug anything into the internet?
So I would say I think we kind of need to separate the different types of technology we're talking about. On your point about the underwriter's laboratory, in particular, I would say sort of like consumer devices, your Nest in your home, the various different, your smart refrigerator, all those sorts of things. I do think that it would be useful. It's something I worked on when I was in the government to try to make some headway there of, being able to make sure that what is sold to the consumer for these, sort of, a digital device that, you could have some sort of physical consequence, if you will. I think it gets much more complicated when you start talking generally about software, and even some of the underlying infrastructure. I think it gets much more complicated to contemplate like a mandatory set of things that anybody and everybody who builds software should do. Part of which is because you're going to shut a lot of people out of the market. And one of the great things about, our technology industry is all the innovation, and really is, allowing the United States in particular to benefit economically for all of that innovation. And so I don't think you want to shut that down. I think instead, you want to think about how do you encourage secure software development life cycles? And NIST has published some work around here. And, it's something that at Google is just like amazing to me to see like how that is really just like designed into the entire process. And I know other companies do the same, but, what is it that, that from a, say NIST perspective, as a well-respected standards organization globally, like there's potentially opportunities to drive more security best practices. I think maybe even standards might be too strong of a word yet, but how do we get more of those best practices? And I know I keep harping on this, but like we need to have like the buyers demanding these things. And, right now you have a lot of companies that they just don't see the need to invest in having that security. When a bug's identified, they'll patch it, they'll fix the bug, or maybe not. And so we need to have a much stronger sort of demand on the buyer side. And the government is just in a really powerful position to be able to do that, given just how much they acquire, all governments really. So those would be kind of some of the things I would think about. There's also, sort of a broader resilience of the entire system question. The internet in how it was able to flourish and the many great things that enabled that are also many of the reasons that we have these problems. And so thinking about how do we understand those points of fragility in how the internet is designed, talking previously about how an attempt at espionage could have potentially destabilizing impacts. WannaCry, another example where the adversary may not even have had the intent of having a deep destabilizing impact, but just the way that things are glued together is increasingly a problem, and as more and more organizations become dependent. So I think, thinking through how do we, incentivize more secure software development. How do we start to, think about if you're a smaller company, I'll be honest, like a lot of companies need to be outsourcing more of their capabilities and not trying to, build and run everything internally. So think about how you can reduce your cost and improve your security by outsourcing more. Those are some of the things I think I would say off the top of my head.
Right. Yeah, all good thoughts. I certainly think you're right that we need to either provide economic incentives or regulatory requirements in order to change behavior. I think given the relative newness of all this technology, after all, the internet is sort of fundamentally about a generation old, under 20 years old, right? The iPhone is 13 years old. I don't know, YouTube is 14 or 15 or so. It's no surprise that this started off with light regulation, and we're now, as problems become manifest, we move into a position of heavier regulation of technology. That's always been our pattern of regulating technology. Let me ask, I'll ask Ed just to comment generally on these points, but given that we're out of time, unfortunately, because we could spend hours on each one of these points, let me just ask Ed to comment specifically on what we've been talking about, but then go back to him and then to you, Jeanette, for a wrap-up question, of which I'm going to try to wrap up a number of the audience questions, all having to do with the theme of, are we just doomed to this type of problem? It's a cat and mouse game or an arms race, cyber arms race, pick whatever metaphor you want, and we're just doomed to it because of the inherent nature of the internet? Or is this something we will be able to surmount and get a handle on? And if so, how? Big question. But Ed, let me turn to you, back to Jeanette, and then we'll have to unfortunately wrap up the program there.
Okay, I don't think we're doomed. I think that I do think it's competitive space, and as long as we keep that in our in mind, but I think I see the defense getting a lot stronger. I think there's a lot of new technologies and concepts on the horizon. I mean, NSA just announced today the Zero Trust document. If you haven't seen it, I mean, that's going to help a lot with ransomware. Could shut it all down if everybody actually did it.
Yep.
So those sorts of things, I see that better. But the idea that it's going to go away, that it won't be competitive, I don't think that's going to happen. But I think we're not doomed. I think there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon here that could help.
Quick question. Do you see us developing an alternate internet, some other more secure, authenticated thing, or are we living with the one we've got?
I'm actually more worried about it splitting apart because of what China's doing and what we're doing. I sort of followed what Eric Schmidt talked about, right?
And on our way to the splinternet.
Yeah.
Jeanette, very quickly.
I do not think we're doomed. I think we're putting too much on the defenders, and they're defending something that's nearly indefensible. And so we've got to build a better mousetrap, if you will. And so I think that on an alternate internet, I think the internet is undergoing a pretty drastic evolution right now. And I think to the point about splintering or not splintering, that is undecided, and I hope it doesn't. And I think it's really key for the government to understand what the economics of the internet ecosystem is and how can they shape it to a way that kind of keeps all the things that we love about it while building it more secure and safe.
Well, I'm sure the audience appreciates that we've only been able to skate across the surface of a very wide range of topics with some fabulous experts today. So let me thank our panelists, thank you and the audience for your attention and your great questions. I wish we could have gotten to more of them, but I know we'll have more programs on this topic. Suzanne, let me hand it back to you with gratitude to you, Dr. Hamre, and CSIS for organizing this.
Glenn, thanks so much. That was terrific. And I want to thank our wonderful cyber leaders for this great conversation. I learned a lot this afternoon, including, as Glenn said, one of the things I learned is that we didn't leave enough time. We didn't schedule enough time for this great conversation. But I'm encouraged by Congressman McCall's request that CSIS work with him on things like international norms. Jeanette's suggestion that we need to do a better job on defining our terms, working on a lexicon, and General Cardone's optimism about where we're headed. So we have our marching orders, and we will absolutely continue these conversations. And thanks to all of you who have joined us this afternoon. Take care.